Hold me, use me, but get me out of here, she trembled. The lonely rancher faced the town's shame. The Colorado sun blazed mercilessly over Red Creek as Sarah McKenna stood on her ranch's weathered porch, watching dust devils dance across the parched earth. 3 months had passed since her father's funeral, and the weight of his absence pressed down on her shoulders like the oppressive August heat. At 24, she'd inherited more than just the Double M Ranch. She'd inherited its debts, its failing cattle, and the suspicious stares of every person in town. Her calloused hands gripped the porch railing as she surveyed the brown grassland that stretched toward the distant mountains. Once, this land had been her father's pride, supporting nearly 200 head of cattle. Now, barely 50 remained, their ribs showing through patchy coats as they searched desperately for decent grazing. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted her brooding. A lone rider approached, kicking up clouds of dust that caught the light like scattered gold. Sarah's stomach clenched as she recognized the portly figure of Harold Grimsby, president of Red Creek's only bank. His visits never brought good news. Grimsby dismounted with obvious effort, his face already flushed from the heat. He removed his hat, revealing thinning hair plastered to his scalp with sweat. "Miss McKenna," he said, his voice carrying the false courtesy that barely concealed his disdain. "I trust you're well?" "As well as can be expected, Mr. Grimsby." Sarah descended the porch steps, her worn boots crunching on the dry earth. She'd learned to meet troubles head-on, a lesson her father had taught her well. "I assume this isn't a social call?" Grimsby's thin smile confirmed her fears. "I'm afraid not. The bank's board met yesterday, and we've reached a decision regarding your father's outstanding loan." He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. "You have 30 days to settle the debt in full or we'll be forced to foreclose on the property." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. 30 days? Mr. Grimsby, you know the cattle market's been terrible this year. The drought's killed most of the grass and— "Business is business, Miss McKenna." Grimsby's interruption was sharp, cutting. "Your father was a good man, but sentiment doesn't pay debts. $3,000, 30 days, those are the terms. $3,000 might as well have been $3 million. Sarah's mind raced, calculating and recalculating the meager funds she could possibly raise. Even selling every remaining head of cattle wouldn't cover half the amount. There must be some alternative. An extension, perhaps, or— "There is one option." Grimsby's eyes took on a calculating gleam that made Sarah's skin crawl. "My son Charles has expressed interest in your situation. A marriage arrangement could resolve everything quite neatly. Charles would assume the debt and you'd have security." The proposal hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, choking and unwelcome. Sarah had known Charles Grimsby since childhood, and the thought of his soft hands and predatory gaze made her stomach turn. He was everything she despised: entitled, cruel, and utterly without honor. "I need time to consider my options," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Of course. But remember, Miss McKenna, pride is a luxury you can no longer afford." Grimsby remounted his horse with considerably more grace than he'd dismounted. 30 days. Don't let stubbornness cost you everything your father worked to build. As the banker rode away, Sarah sank onto the porch steps, burying her face in her hands. The ranch represented more than property. It was her father's legacy, her mother's memory, the only home she'd ever known. Losing it would mean starting over with nothing, probably as a seamstress or schoolteacher in some distant town where nobody knew the McKenna name. But marrying Charles Grimsby felt like a different kind of death. The sun continued its relentless assault on the parched landscape as Sarah wrestled with her impossible choice. In the distance, her remaining cattle moved listlessly through the failing pasture, and she wondered if her father would have found a way out of this mess. Thomas McKenna had been a proud man, respected throughout the territory for his integrity and fair dealing. What would he think of the options now facing his daughter? A bitter laugh escaped Sarah's lips. Her father had always said that desperate times called for desperate measures, but she doubted he'd ever imagined circumstances quite this desperate. As the shadows lengthened and the heat began to ease, one thought crystallized in her mind with stunning clarity. She would do whatever it took to save the ranch regardless of what the town thought of her choices, even if it meant sacrificing everything else she held dear. The decision settled in her chest like a stone, heavy and immovable. Tomorrow she would ride into Red Creek and explore options she'd never before considered. Tonight she would say goodbye to the woman she used to be. The morning sun cast long shadows across Red Creek's main street as Sarah guided her mare toward the town's commercial district. The familiar sounds of frontier life, hammering from the blacksmith shop, the creak of wagon wheels, children's laughter from the schoolyard, seemed muted today as if the very air had thickened with her shame. She'd spent a sleepless night wrestling with her decision, pacing the ranch house floors that still echoed with her father's footsteps. By dawn, desperation had crystallized into resolve. There was only one way to raise $3,000 in 30 days, and it wasn't through selling cattle or taking in laundry. The Red Creek Saloon stood at the end of Main Street like a beacon of ill repute, its painted facade already peeling in the harsh mountain climate. Sarah had never set foot inside, but she knew its reputation. Men came here for whiskey, cards, and companionship that wives and sweethearts couldn't provide. It was exactly the kind of place her father had warned her against, and exactly where she needed to go. Taking a deep breath, Sarah dismounted and tied her horse to the hitching post. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her best dress, a faded blue cotton that had seen better days but was still respectable. She'd braided her auburn hair carefully, trying to look presentable despite the circumstances. The saloon's interior was dimmer than expected, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on smoke-stained walls. A few early drinkers nursed whiskey at scattered tables, their conversations dying as Sarah entered. Behind the bar, a woman with painted cheeks and knowing eyes looked up from polishing glasses. "Well, I'll be damned," the woman said, her voice carrying the rough edges of too many cigarettes and hard years. "If it isn't little Sarah McKenna, gracing us with her presence." "Mrs. Rodriguez," Sarah replied, recognizing the saloon owner despite the years that had passed since she'd seen her around town. I need to speak with you about a business proposition." Consuela Rodriguez had run the Red Creek Saloon for 15 years, ever since her husband died in a mining accident. She was shrewd, tough, and surprisingly fair in her dealings, qualities that had earned her grudging respect even from the town's more respectable citizens. "Business, is it?" Consuela's dark eyes appraised Sarah with uncomfortable intensity. "Step into my office, girl. This conversation ain't for public consumption." The small room behind the bar was surprisingly neat, with ledger books stacked on a simple wooden desk and a faded photograph of a handsome man Sarah assumed was the late Mr. Rodriguez. Consuela closed the door and gestured for Sarah to sit in one of two chairs facing the desk. "Now then," Consuela said, settling into her own chair with practiced ease. "What kind of business brings Thomas McKenna's daughter into my establishment?" Sarah's throat felt dry as sandpaper, but she forced herself to speak. "I need work. The kind that pays well and pays quickly." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Consuela leaned back, studying Sarah's face with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to reading people's deepest motivations. "How much do you need?" $3,000. A low whistle escaped Consuela's lips. "That's serious money, girl. More than most of my girls make in 2 years. She paused, drumming her fingers on the desk. "What's got you this desperate?" Sarah explained about the bank loan, her father's death, and Grimsby's ultimatum. With each word, she felt pieces of her former self breaking away like paint chips in the wind. When she finished, Consuela was quiet for a long moment. "You know what you're asking?" Consuela said finally. "Once word gets out, and word always gets out, there ain't no going back. The good people of Red Creek will cross the street to avoid you. Their wives will whisper behind your back for the rest of your life." "I know." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "And you're willing to trade your reputation for that ranch?" "It's all I have left of my family." Consuela studied her for another long moment, then nodded slowly. "You've got grit, I'll give you that. Your father would be proud of your determination, even if he wouldn't approve of your methods." She opened one of the ledger books and ran her finger down a column of figures. "I can offer you work, but 3,000 is a steep hill to climb. You'd need to work every night for months, and that's assuming business stays good." The reality of what she was contemplating hit Sarah like a cold mountain wind. Months of... She couldn't even form the thought completely. But the alternative was losing everything her father had built, everything that connected her to her family's memory. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said. "Then we'll start tonight. But Sarah," Consuela's voice carried a warning tone, "once you walk upstairs with your first customer, there ain't no pretending it didn't happen. You sure this is the only way?" Sarah thought of Charles Grimsby's leering smile, of Harold Grimsby's ultimatum, of the ranch that represented everything her family had sacrificed to build. It's the only way I can live with myself. As Sarah left the saloon, she noticed how the afternoon light seemed different, harsher somehow, casting shadows that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Henderson from the general store watched her emerge from the establishment, and Sarah saw the exact moment when understanding dawned in the older woman's eyes. By evening, everyone in Red Creek would know where Thomas McKenna's daughter had gone seeking employment. The whispers had already begun. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah began working at the Red Creek Saloon, and the town's judgment had been swift and merciless. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. Shopkeepers served her with cold efficiency, and children were pulled close to their mothers' skirts when she passed. The isolation cut deeper than she'd expected, but the growing stack of bills in her room above the saloon reminded her why she endured it all. The autumn evening air carried the first hint of winter as Sarah stood at her small window, watching the familiar bustle of Main Street below. She'd grown accustomed to the routine, the miners finishing their shifts, the cowboys riding in from distant ranches, the steady stream of men who climbed the saloon's back stairs under cover of darkness. Each night brought her closer to the $3,000 she needed, but the weight of their stares and whispered comments grew heavier with each passing day. A commotion in the street below caught her attention. A lone rider was dismounting in front of the general store, his movements fluid despite obvious fatigue. Even from her second-story window, Sarah could see this wasn't one of the local men. His clothes were trail-worn but well-made, his horse a fine bay gelding that spoke of quality breeding. Most telling of all, he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man comfortable with danger. Jake Morrison had been riding for 3 days straight, following rumors of work at a ranch outside Red Creek. At 32, he'd spent the better part of a decade drifting from town to town, taking jobs that ranged from cattle driving to bounty hunting. The work suited him. It required no permanent attachments, no explanations about his past, and no promises he couldn't keep. Red Creek looked like 100 other frontier towns he'd passed through, but something felt different as he walked down Main Street. Conversations died when he passed, and the looks he received carried an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with his arrival. Towns developed their own rhythms, their own secrets, and this one was clearly harboring something significant. The general store provided the usual supplies and the expected small talk from the proprietor, a nervous man named Henderson, who seemed eager to discuss everything except whatever was troubling the town. Jake had learned long ago that the quickest way to understand a place was to find where men went to drink and talk freely. The Red Creek Saloon's bat-wing doors opened to reveal a surprisingly well-appointed interior. Unlike many frontier drinking establishments, this one showed signs of a woman's touch: clean glasses, swept floors, and oil lamps that actually provided adequate light. The woman behind the bar was handsome despite her years, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Evening, stranger," she said, automatically reaching for a bottle of whiskey. "Don't believe I've seen you in these parts before." "Jake Morrison," he replied, accepting the glass she poured. "Just passing through, looking for work. Heard there might be ranches hiring." Consuelo Rodriguez studied the newcomer with professional interest. He was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of hard living and harder choices. His gun sat easily on his hip, worn with the familiarity of long use, but his manner was polite rather than threatening. "Ranching work's scarce around here," she said carefully. "Most spreads are struggling with the drought. You might try the double M, but—" She paused as if reconsidering her words. "But what?" Before Consuela could answer, the sound of footsteps on the back stairs drew Jake's attention. A young woman descended into the main room, and Jake felt something shift in the atmosphere around him. She was beautiful in the way that mountain wildflowers were beautiful, natural, unadorned, but with an inner strength that couldn't be manufactured or faked. Sarah McKenna moved through the saloon with practiced efficiency, her auburn hair catching the lamplight as she served drinks and made conversation with the evening's customers. But Jake noticed things others might miss: the way she held herself slightly apart, the careful distance she maintained even while appearing friendly, and most tellingly, the sadness that lived behind her green eyes like shadows in deep water. "That's Sarah McKenna," Consuela said quietly, following Jake's gaze. "She owns the Double M ranch you were asking about." Jake watched as Sarah interacted with a table of miners, her laugh bright but somehow hollow. Something about her situation didn't fit the usual pattern of saloon girls he'd encountered in his travels. "She runs a ranch and works here?" "It's complicated," Consuela replied, her voice carrying layers of meaning. "The girl's got more troubles than anyone her age should carry." As if sensing their conversation, Sarah glanced toward the bar and met Jake's eyes. For a moment, something passed between them. Recognition of shared loneliness, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that they were both outsiders in their own ways. Then she looked away, returning to her duties with renewed focus. Jake finished his whiskey and placed a coin on the bar. "Think I'll ride out to that ranch tomorrow. Always good to introduce yourself to the neighbors." "You do that," Consuela said, but her tone suggested she knew more than she was saying. "Just remember, everyone's fighting battles you can't see from the outside." As Jake left the saloon, he found himself thinking about the young woman behind the bar. He'd learned to read people quickly. It was a survival skill in his line of work. But Sarah McKenna presented a puzzle he couldn't easily solve. She was clearly educated and well-bred, yet here she was working in a saloon in a frontier town that seemed to view her with a mixture of pity and disdain. The October stars were brilliant in the clear mountain air, as Jake settled into his bedroll behind the livery stable. Tomorrow, he would ride out to the Double M Ranch and perhaps get some answers to the questions that had been forming since he'd first laid eyes on Sarah McKenna. Something told him that his plans to simply pass through Red Creek had just become considerably more complicated. In her room above the saloon, Sarah stared out at those same stars and wondered about the stranger who'd watched her with such intensity. There had been no judgment in his eyes, no calculation of her worth based on her current circumstances. For the first time in weeks, she'd felt seen rather than simply observed. But hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. The morning sun painted the Double M Ranch in shades of gold and amber as Jake Morrison rode up the dusty trail toward the main house. The property showed clear signs of struggle: fences needing repair, a barn with loose boards, and pastures that should have been thick with cattle but held only scattered thin animals. Yet beneath the surface neglect, Jake could see the bones of what had once been a prosperous operation. Sarah emerged from the barn as he approached, her sleeves rolled up and her hands dusty from morning chores. She'd been mucking stalls since dawn, trying to maintain some semblance of normal ranch operations despite spending her nights at the saloon. The sight of the stranger from the previous evening brought her up short, uncertainty flickering across her features. "Mr. Morrison," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I didn't expect to see you out here." Jake dismounted, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that felt natural despite the circumstances. "Miss McKenna, I heard you might be looking for help around the ranch. Thought I'd offer my services." The bitter laugh that escaped Sarah's lips held no humor. "I'm afraid I can't pay much. Most of what I earn goes toward—" She gestured vaguely, unable to finish the sentence that would acknowledge her evening employment. "Maybe we could work out an arrangement," Jake said carefully. "Room and board and a small wage when you're able. I've got experience with cattle, horses, and general ranch work." Sarah studied him with the wariness of someone who'd learned that kindness often came with hidden costs. "Why would you want to work for a woman like me? Surely you've heard the talk in town." "I've heard talk in a lot of towns," Jake replied evenly. "Most of it says more about the talkers than the people they're discussing." The simple acceptance in his words nearly undid Sarah's careful composure. She'd grown so accustomed to judgment and whispered condemnation that basic human decency felt like a gift she didn't deserve. But practical concerns quickly reasserted themselves. Even if I could afford help, what would people say about a single woman having a man working her ranch while she— The words stuck in her throat like thorns. "Let them talk," Jake said with quiet conviction. "From what I can see, you're trying to save something worth saving. That's more than most people can say." Over the following days, Jake proved himself invaluable around the Double M. He repaired fence lines with skill born of long experience, treated sick cattle with the care of someone who understood their value, and gradually began to restore order to the neglected ranch operations. More importantly, he treated Sarah with a respectful dignity that she'd almost forgotten existed. Their conversations began hesitantly, discussions of ranch business that gradually expanded to include stories of their pasts. Jake spoke carefully about his years of drifting, the jobs that had taken him from Texas to Colorado, and points between. Sarah found herself sharing memories of her father, her mother's death when she was 12, and the dreams she'd once harbored for the ranch's future. "You don't have to keep doing this," Jake said one evening as Sarah prepared to leave for the saloon. They were standing on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant oranges and purples. "Yes, I do," Sarah replied, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "I'm still $800 short and Grimsby's deadline is next week." Jake had been thinking about Harold Grimsby and his ultimatum, and the more he learned about the situation, the angrier he became. There might be another way. "What do you mean?" Jake hesitated, knowing that what he was about to propose would change everything between them. "Marry me." The words hung in the evening air like smoke from a distant fire. Sarah turned to stare at him, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "It's a practical solution," Jake continued, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "A married woman's debts become her husband's responsibility. I've got money saved, enough to pay off Grimsby and give the ranch a fresh start." Sarah's mind reeled with the implications. Marriage to Jake Morrison would solve her immediate problems, but it would also bind her to a man she barely knew. "You can't be serious. We've known each other less than 2 weeks. I've seen enough to know you're worth saving," Jake said simply. "And the ranch is worth saving too. As for the rest," he shrugged, a gesture that encompassed all the unknowns that lay ahead. "We'll figure it out as we go." The proposal was simultaneously the most practical and most terrifying thing Sarah had ever heard. Marriage would free her from the saloon, from the nightly degradation that was slowly eating away at her soul. But it would also mean trusting her future to a man whose past remained largely mysterious. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for someone you barely know?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the western sky. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old wounds and careful honesty. "Maybe because I know what it's like to have nowhere else to turn. Maybe because I've spent too many years drifting without purpose, and this feels like something worth staying for." The next morning, Sarah stood before the mirror in her small room above the saloon, studying her reflection with new eyes. In 3 hours, she would walk to the small church at the end of Main Street and marry Jake Morrison. The hastily arranged ceremony would be witnessed by Consuela Rodriguez and the town preacher, with no family present to celebrate or object. Her wedding dress was the same faded blue cotton she'd worn on her first desperate visit to the saloon, hardly the gown she'd once dreamed of wearing on her wedding day. But dreams, like so many other luxuries, had become casualties of her circumstances. As Sarah made her way downstairs, she found Consuela waiting with an envelope containing her final wages. "You sure about this, girl?" the older woman asked, her dark eyes filled with maternal concern. "No," Sarah admitted, "but I'm sure I can't keep living the way I have been." The walk to the church felt like both the longest and shortest journey of Sarah's life. Jake waited at the altar in his best clothes, his hat in his hands and his expression serious but kind. As she took his hand and repeated the marriage vows, Sarah felt the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on her shoulders. Some had come to witness her wedding out of curiosity, others out of spite, but few had come to celebrate. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jake's kiss was gentle and brief, the kiss of a man who understood that trust would need to be earned rather than simply expected. As they walked down the aisle together, Sarah caught sight of Harold Grimsby's face in the crowd. His expression of frustrated rage told her that he'd heard about the marriage and understood exactly what it meant for his son's chances and his own financial expectations. That evening, Jake presented Harold Grimsby with a bank draft for the full amount of the ranch's debt plus interest. The banker's fury was barely contained, but business was business, and the transaction was legally binding. The Double M Ranch was finally, truly free. As Sarah and Jake stood on their porch that night watching stars emerge in the clear mountain sky, both understood that their hasty marriage was the beginning of something entirely unknown. They had saved the ranch and each other, but the future stretched ahead of them like an uncharted territory, full of promise and peril in equal measure. "Hold me, use me, but get me out of here," Sarah whispered, echoing the desperate prayer that had brought her to this moment. Jake's arms encircled her gently, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt truly safe. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. What did you think of Sarah and Jake's incredible journey from desperation to hope? Their story of courage, sacrifice, and unexpected love in the harsh frontier of 1880s Colorado shows us that sometimes the most difficult choices lead to the most beautiful beginnings. If this tale of resilience touched your heart, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you thought about Sarah's brave decision and Jake's selfless proposal. Did their unconventional love story surprise you? What would you have done in Sarah's situation? Don't forget to subscribe for more compelling stories of love, courage, and redemption set in America's untamed past. Your support helps me bring these powerful human dramas to life, and I can't wait to share the next emotional journey with you.